Question number 7, Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Education, does she agree with Bill English that a lot of Kiwis are pretty damned hopeless and that they can't read and write properly? If so, does she accept any responsibility as Minister for Education?
The Honourable Hikia Parata.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think the House is better served by the Deputy Prime Minister's full quote, with which I do agree, and it was. And the dairy industry has rightly said that a lot of the Kiwis that are turning up are pretty damned hopeless. They won't show up, you can't rely on them, and that's one of the reasons the immigration's a bit permissive to fill the gap, but we can't leave that problem unsolved, which is in the long run. We can't leave that problem unsolved. That is a cohort of Kiwis that now can't get a licence because they can't read and write properly and don't look to be employable. You know, basically young males. And if we don't work together to get them working, then they'll be with us a long time. End of quote. In regard to the second part, I do accept response.
Order.
Perhaps I'll finish the question. I do accept.
Order. Order.
Perhaps I'll finish
Order.
answering the question.
No,
oh, beg your pardon.
I just require a little more cooperation from this side from one particular member. The answer was long, but it was completing a quote to give justification to the question, so I allowed that. There's 2 parts to the question, and the member who asked the question deserves a response to the second part. The Honourable Hikia Parata.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In regard to the second part, I do accept responsibility for my part as Minister of Education, but we all have a role to play, including the member, in encouraging educational success in all our young people.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
When Bill English claimed that a lot of Kiwis can't read and write properly, was he basing that claim on a recent Tertiary Education Commission study that found that up to half the students meeting NCEA literacy and numeracy requirements are not functionally literate or numerate? If not, what was he basing it on?
The Honourable Hikia Parata.
Mr. Speaker, well, I'm not responsible for what was in the mind of the Deputy Prime Minister, but I'd hazard a guess he was basing it on the education system when it was run under that opposition.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
While we're on that topic, could Bill English have been basing his claim on the fact that whilst NCEA achievement rates for Māori and Pacifica students have shown modest increases, in the past 5 years the number of New Zealand European students gaining NCEA has fallen across the board, with an 11% drop in the number meeting minimum university entrance standards?
The Honourable Hikia Parata.
Mr. Speaker, the member is either playing fast and loose with the statistics or just doesn't understand them. So first of all, Māori and Pacifica, I don't know in his world how 30 and 32% increases are modest, but Māori and Pacifica have gone from 43% under that government to 72%. Pacifica have gone from 51 to 79% under this government, and overall, including New Zealand Pākehā, have gone to 84.4%. It is not possible that there has been a drop in terms of NCEA. In terms of university entrance, yes, we took the decision to raise the standard of university entrance to ensure that when young people go to university, they are able to complete the degree. That is a service that we have performed, and we were prepared to do it, and we will continue to raise the quality of education of all New Zealanders.
Mr. Speaker, point of order.
Point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I seek leave to table a memorandum to the NZQA board from the NZQA staff dated the 23rd of February 2016, which has the statistics I referred to showing a drop for New Zealand European students.
Leave us sought to table that particular NZQA board report. Is there any objection? There is none. It can be tabled. Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Mr. Speaker, why should parents have confidence in this government's management of the education system when the Deputy Prime Minister describes Kiwi kids as pretty damned hopeless, while at the same time in his role as Finance Minister, he's presided over funding cuts that have seen schools spending less per student in real terms than they were spending when National took office?
The Honourable Hikia Parata.
Mr. Speaker, parents should have confidence because they aren't having to be barraged with the nonsense coming from the opposition, and instead are getting transparent data that is used appropriately in its context, not misused or misleading, and is available to them every day in real time at every school.
question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Why does this government have such low expectations for the 64,000 young New Zealanders under the age of 25 who are unemployed, choosing to label them as pretty damned hopeless, as Bill English did, rather than training them and educating them to do the jobs that are available?
The Honourable Hiki Parata.
Mr Speaker, before I came to the House at 2 o'clock, I was addressing a hui of about 60 workers who are focused on an initiative called Count Me In. And their job is to go out into the country and find the kids that have disengaged from education and reconnect them to education. In Gisborne, we are running a pilot for Year 9 kids who are likely to fall by the wayside because their siblings have, and we are ensuring they get a better education. Across the country, through trades academies, through vocational pathways, through better relationships with industry, business and employers, we are identifying the skill sets that young people need to have to make them more employable. The very kids that were the subject of the dairy dairy industry's concern, we are now making it possible for driver's licences to achieve credits at school so more kids can drive. Thank you.
Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, why is this government so out of touch with the reality of underfunding that schools face every day, overlooks declining student achievement and labels the 64,000 young New Zealanders who are unemployed as pretty damned hopeless, rather than educating and training them to meet some of the most critical skill shortages New Zealand has ever seen?
The Honourable Hiki Parata.
Mr Speaker, it's actually quite hard to...
Order. I want to hear the answer. The Honourable Hiki Parata.
Mr Speaker, it's actually quite difficult to find anything in that rant that has a smidgen of truth to it that allows me to respond. But I'm going to have a go. This government has very high expectations for all New Zealanders, not for some, as under that administration occurred, but for all New Zealanders at every stage of their education. That's why we introduced national standards, so that we would know every year how well kids were or were not doing. That's why we've introduced better public service targets, because we're prepared to be transparent and held ourselves accountable. That's why we've seen a 31% increase in vote education, while student numbers have...
Order. Long enough. Supplementary question, David Seymour.
Was the Minister aware that the Māori Year 13 students at the Partnership School Kurahorua Te Ringa Paraoa achieved a 100% pass rate for university entrance last year, and that Chris Hipkins wants to close that school?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Hiki Parata, either of those two supplementary questions.
Mr Speaker, I was aware, and it would appear the member was too, and she wants to join in the congratulations to those young people, and I would like to commend the Kurahorua and the Parliamentary Under-Secretary for his support and applause of success. Something foreign to the member, obviously, but success for young people who otherwise would not have been.
Supplementary question, the Honourable... Order. Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Question.
To the Minister, why won't the Minister fund alternative education properly to employ qualified teachers to help our most needy students so they don't become, to quote Bill English, pretty damn hopeless? Or does she agree with education expert Judy Bruce, who said, quote, "This is the Ministry of Education's dirty little secret"?
The Honourable Hiki Parata.
Yeah, well, again, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of that particular expert that the member is quoting, but did the member want an answer? Alternative education is fully funded. It is currently under review. It is currently under review because the outcomes from there are not as good as other parts that we are investing in, and we want to invest in success. So the member can be assured that it is very much on my agenda.
Order. Point of order, the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table a report indicating that alternative education students are underfunded by 10 to 15%.
I need the source of the report and the date.
It's a press statement, Mr Speaker.
Order. Member will resume his seat immediately. I used to think the member was better than that. Question number 8, Catherine Delahunty.
Tēnā koe